Yeah. Well, all right. So let's go. We
Yeah,
will
I've got
record it.
my phone, so go ahead and share your screen. I'll record it and put it on YouTube.
Yeah. So like we're getting some feedback there. All right. So what I'm going to talk about is obviously trying to put the COVID pandemic into perspective here. I don't have any financial disclosures, but you know, we have a lot of crazy times these days. It's difficult economic, obviously, the healthcare and mental health of people, and a lot of people have decided to look back into the past and try to decide if there's some guidance or solace from that. So the question we're going to try to answer is history helpful when something like this happens? So uh, there we go. All right, so this kind of comes back to the medical humanities, which I've talked to you guys before about, which is really kind of the use of different disciplines of humanities. And that can be literature, philosophy, can be the social sciences too, anthropology, psychology, sociology are incredibly important these days. And then the arts and how people have expressed their fears and anxieties in different forms of both art and literature and music. So this is kind of what I'm going to try to go through is what is a pandemic, and then relative size compared to other pandemics we've endured on Earth. A little bit about pandemic speak and are not. We're going to talk about two large pandemics. One is the second wave of the plague, which is called the Black Death. That's 1348 and forward, and then influenza, which is almost exactly 100 years ago from now. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means for the medical system, public health, economic recovery, and mental health. And a little bit about some human nature and some memes, which hopefully you'll find entertaining. So this is a book that was written in 1972, and this was a noted virologist from Australia, actually, Macfarlane Burnett. He said he thought that ID was actually going to be, infectious disease was going to be very dull, and that we could have some wholly unexpected emergency of a new and dangerous infectious disease, but nothing of the sort is marked in the last 50 years. So obviously he's referring back to the 1919. And it's almost exactly 50 years since that, that we now have COVID. So this is the dashboard, and this is actually from Johns Hopkins. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it's probably the most systematic compilation of cases throughout the world. We're about 38 million cases and a little over a million, almost 100,000 deaths. So a tremendous amount of pestilence in the world. And so if you compare that to things like the Black Death, bubonic plague, there was about 200 million people who died there. As opposed to this current rate of about a million, we're talking 200 times as big. Smallpox in the 1500s in the United States and the Americas killed off an enormous number of the indigenous people. Spanish flu here is about 40 to 50 million. And that is 1918, 1919. It turns out that HIV is actually fairly good size, 25 to 35 million. And then Corona, when this thing was made, this was back in March. Obviously, it's now just about a million deaths. So it would be right in this range of what the Russian flu was, sort of 1889. And we've had other episodes, Hong Kong flu, et cetera. So it's in the range of an influenza pandemic. It's not as big as the Spanish flu in 1918, but it's still quite large, and obviously it's not over. So if you try to put that into perspective relative to other plagues have been related to either smallpox or measles or Yersinia, which is could cause bubonic or pneumonic plague. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. We're going to talk about the plague of Justinian, which was the first wave, but the Black Death is really considered the second wave of Yersinia, and somewhere between 75 and 200 million people died. So the world population at that time was only about 390 million. If you compare that to COVID now, even with a million deaths, we have almost 7.5 billion people on Earth. So a marked amount. So if you talk about 200 million out of 400, that's basically either 40 or 50% of the population. Here we're talking about a very small number compared to the number of people on Earth, but obviously it's still a very high number. So this is kind of the world's population. It took about 200,000 years to get to about 200,000 people on Earth. And then it took them only about 200 years to go up to almost 7.5 billion. And this part right here is actually the only time that the world population actually went down, and that is the Black Plague there. Otherwise, it's been going up pretty much straight up in the 20th and 21st century. And those countries like China and India are the largest populations. The United States obviously is increased in population as well. And we've become very urbanized in our approach to daily living. So what's the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic? Well, an epidemic is a community or a region where an illness is out of proportion to its normal expectancy. So we have normal influenza each year, and we would look for an increase relative to our normal influenza, for instance. But a pandemic is worldwide. And for COVID, that was declared on March 11th. And that was about the time that we went into a pretty big lockdown in the United States. So these occur when either there's a new agent. This is really what happened here, is that agent went from being in either bats or pangolins into humans. Maybe in this meat market, that's one of the possibilities. But there's about 30 different coronaviruses. We check for about 4 in the hospital. Now we check for 5. But there's a lot of them that could come in the future. So we're probably not done with corona, even if this current one actually gets tamped down. And then sometimes the mode of transmission changes or the susceptibility of the host. And we've seen this problem in the host, that people in nursing homes, people with chronic illnesses, immunosuppression, transplantation, autoimmune diseases, they're all very sensitive to this virus and the effects of it. And then you add in things that we've done in the last 50 to 100 years. The global travel is way up, just like it was around the time of World War I. There was a lot of people moving around different countries. Urbanization has increased in its velocity in the last 50 years. We now have these mega cities throughout the world. Climate change, and we've encroached on environments that we haven't seen before. And then there's increased human to animal domestic contact, and specifically animals like chickens, cows, things that we use for our food chain. There's now an enormous number of those on Earth, and they're part of the vector that gets the virus to us. Population growth, we've talked. Civil unrest, so if you can't get into an area and help control a disease, it can become out of control. So you've probably heard about this, but R0 just tells you if you have a person with an illness, how many people are going to get that illness from that individual person. So if you look at COVID, it's about 1.5 to 3 patients are going to get that COVID from that individual person. And if you can get that R value less than 1, then it means your pandemic is actually decreasing in size. If it's above 1, it's increasing in size. So MERS, which we saw, which is Middle East respiratory syndrome, and we saw the SARS-1, those had R0s in 1, 1.5 range. Smallpox is much higher, 5 to 7. Measles is very high, 12 to 18. So for every patient, 12 to 18 others would have it. And here's SARS that we had in the early 2000s. Its R0 is actually slightly lower than the COVID-19. So this is a drawing or a painting, actually. It's in Basel in Switzerland. But this is sort of the Black Death flying in, sort of randomly killing people in the streets, people, bereft and, loved ones that have died from this, buboes and on their necks and their backs. So throughout this talk, I'm going to give you some ideas about books you might want to read. This is a really good description of the Black Plague. It actually is written by Dr. Kelly, and it really talks about probably the most important description. So I think if you want to read more about the Black Death, that's where to go. So this is actually Florence, and you can see there's people just sort of stacked up in the streets. There's people sort of prostrating themselves. There's religious figures, there's religious icons, people trying to get some relief from this pestilence. But this is the Black Plague. Saint Roch or Roche is the patron saint of the plague. And if you see a statue that has like sort of a bubo, and a bubo is just sort of an inflamed lymph node. This happens to be on the leg here. St. Roch was supposed to have had plague, was actually quite weak and couldn't do anything. The dog actually brought him food and actually licked his wounds. And between the two of those, he actually recovered from the plague. So it's a tribute to the animals, but it also is this sort of patron saint when you're sick with the plague. This is the person to pray to. So historians like to go back to things that are written at the time something's happened, because 25, 50 years after something happens, you have a lot more perspective on it. So they try to look for things that were written at the same time. So in the Black Plague, Boccaccio actually wrote about this in the introduction to his Decameron. So the Decameron was 100 stories that people from Florence had moved out of Florence into a sort of a rural villa, and they were entertaining each other each night with stories. And so the Decameron was one of each night for 100 nights. They talked about different stories. But he describes the Black Death as the symptoms were not the same as in the East. There was a gush of blood from the nose, plain sight of inevitable death. It began both in men and women, and certain swelling in the groin or into the armpit. Those are the buboes. Soon after, these symptoms changed, and black or purple spots appeared on the arms and thighs. That's really sepsis and other parts of the body. No doctor's advice, no medicine could overcome or alleviate the disease. An enormous number of ignorant men and women set up as doctors in addition to those who were trained. And I'm not sure how good the training was back then. Most people died within about 3 days of the appearance of the tumors, most of them without any fever or other symptoms. The violence of this disease was such that the sick communicated it to the healthy who came near them. So obviously you needed to stay away. To speak or go near the sick brought infection and a common death to the living. And moreover, to touch the clothes or anything else the sick had touched, this is called fomite transmission. We've talked a lot about whether coronavirus stays on surfaces or not, gave the disease to other people. So this was the response. If you had money, you left the city. They formed small communities living entirely separately from everybody else. They shut themselves up in houses where there were no sick, eating the finest food and drinking the best wine very temperately, avoiding all excesses, allowing no news or discussion of death or sickness, and passing the time in music or such like pleasures. So I think we've seen that in this current plague. If you travel to Florence, you're going to see these little windows. They're called wine windows, and they're hollowed out so that you could hand food or wine into the house or back out of the house without having to come in contact. So I kind of imagine this is the early fast food drive-through to drop off stuff, or the DoorDash, whatever. But he also talks about the breakdown in social order. So one citizen avoided another, hardly any neighbor troubled about others. Relatives never or hardly ever visited each other. Sound familiar? Moreover, such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity that brother abandoned brother. And he says, what's even worse and nearly incredible is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend to their children as if they had not been theirs. Imagine that. So the plight of the lower, most of the middle classes was even more pitiful to behold. Most of them remained in their houses either through poverty or in hopes of safety, and fell sick by the thousands. Since they received no care or attention, almost all of them died. And this has been seen in this outbreak too, that it's actually had a differential effect in darker skins, lower socioeconomic status, etc. So he's describing this, literally 600 years ago. So the description could be today. Anyway, so Yersinia is a bacteria. The first plague actually was around 483 to 541. That was called the plague of Justinian. That's called the first pandemic. And it was described by a historian then. The second pandemic is considered the start of the Black Plague. And there were years and years of plague, but this is when it started, the first 4 years. And that's where that description from Florence comes from. It is a gram-negative bacteria. It is actually spread by fleas on the backs of rats. And there's some description about what they did with cats back then, because they thought the cats were bringing the plague and they got rid of them. And that actually was a counterproductive. But anyway, these are the two types of rat species that carry it. So the original cases probably happened in 1346 in Kappa. I'm going to show you where that is in a minute. It was really bioterrorism. So they took these people that had died of bubonic plague and they launched their corpses over the walls to kill the people inside. Well, the people inside, once they saw these corpses coming over, decided to get the heck out of there. And a lot of them fled back to Italy. They were sailors and other people that were down there. So Kaffa is right here, right on the Crimea, and the Crimea has actually been in the news with Russia in the last few years. That's probably where it started. This orange color is 1347. And then remember these sailors that came back, 1347, they had cases in Italy and Florence at that point. And then the green is 1348, the yellow is 1349. You can see it going out in waves as the disease spread. So each one of these countries had something called the dance of death. And what it really described was that no matter what your station in life was, you were susceptible to this disease. And we've seen, the President of the United States come down with coronavirus. So it isn't just your status in life. And they all had little pictures of, priests and nuns and children and elderly, all of them being taken away by this dance of death. The thing I find interesting is actually they've gone back and analyzed both bone and teeth from graves that were placed during the Black Plague. And you can analyze those for DNA as well as proteins. And you can determine that not only was Yersinia pestis, but you can actually determine the type of Yersinia pestis and how it spread across Europe. So just remembering that the bubonic plague is in your lymph nodes, the bubo that's a lymph node. Pneumonic plague is actually in your lungs, and that's actually the most infectious. And that's the most rapid way to die of this. It is spread both respiratory and by contact. It does cause pneumonitis, which is your lungs, obviously pneumonia, bubonic plague, which is the lymph nodes, and then septicemia, which is just sepsis. So it's a bacterial sepsis. And that's when those people had the purple markings and died. So this is an example. This is about 1480. This is a bubo being lanced on the neck, and here's one under the armpit. And so this is actually the gear that they would use to go visit these people. So they would actually not touch the patient. They used the stick to examine them. They had gloves on. They had a very long cloak on. They had a little, what looks like almost a mask with little goggles on, a hat, and then shoes. And this is a more recent one. This is actually in Venice when they have their Bacchanal over there. But if I can't possibly miss the analogy between what we look like when we go in to see COVID patients now. The snout is a little shorter, but I'm pretty sure that's what Jackie looked like when she was seeing all those swabs. So, and I can't imagine how you did that in 100-degree heat. So my hat's off to you and Joseph, Carol. All right, anyway, so the idea of mental health is really a more recent phenomenon, but I tried to dig back a little bit into what was going on with medieval public health or mental health. And this is actually the idea that insanity was something that was inside your brain and that you needed to have it excised. So they're taking this stone out of insanity here. There's several different representations of this. This one happens to be in the Prado. And this guy, I don't know if I would let this guy even close to me, let alone take out something out of my head. And there's somebody here praying and etc. It's obviously a kind of a mixture of religion and science. And here's another one. This is Bosch, also in the Prado, sort of taking out insanity. So we don't know much about what happened to the mental health around that pandemic, but I can imagine it was bad. But we have plague today. This is the United States here. This is places that reported plague or it occurs in animals. You can see it's still worldwide. If you follow the news, a couple months ago up in South Lake Tahoe, there was a plague case up there, bubonic plague. So it's still with us. 600 years later, we know how to treat it now. It's not that big a deal. It's just antibiotics. But I think when we get done with Corona, we'll have a better idea how to fix it too. So this is 1918. You folks on the call would actually know what that is. When I present this to our younger house staff, they have no idea what that little machine is. So they've never seen a typewriter, especially a manual typewriter, where the keys actually came out with touching it. So anyway, so you can see the ever-present mask here. This is 1918 in New York. This book is a fantastic book describing influenza and the rise of sort of the medical infrastructure to deal with infections and deal with to create antibiotics and to create clinical trials, randomized clinical trials. But this is a description of, this is all-cause death in the years right before 1918. So this is New York City, 1914, 15, 17, 18. They had about 100 deaths per 100,000. And then when you get to 1918, they're almost 300 deaths per 100,000 here. So a tremendous jump. But this is more recent, 2017 to 2020. You can see the death rate is about half of what it was before. We were much better at treating things, antibiotics, ICUs, ventilators, transfusions, you name it. But look at this increase here, almost 200 per 100,000. That's not so far off from what we saw in the 1918 H1N1. So this has been a tremendous pestilence in New York City, and that really was ground zero, unfortunately, again, for Corona, and obviously during the World Trade Center. So influenza gets to us through animals. There's native hosts, which are primarily water birds, but then the water birds get into either pigs, chickens, or cattle. And there's a tremendous amount of all three of those on the earth these days. And so then they redistribute these antigens, H1N1, hemagglutinin, and neuroamidase, and those get sent to us as new waves each year, what we call swine flu or bird flu, equine flu, etc. Even whales can get influenza because they're actually mammals. So it turns out if you go back each century all the way back to 1700s, where there's reasonably good records, there's about 3 pandemics a year, or 3 pandemics per century. And it's pretty reliable. I mentioned this one already, the Russian flu, which is 1889, 1890. We had the Spanish flu, we had Asian flu, we had Hong Kong flu. And then in the 2000s, we had H1N1 in 2009. So there's 2 question marks there about when the next one's coming for us, at least in the 21st century. So just to take you back a little bit, what was going on in 1918, sort of right around the pandemic? Well, obviously World War I had been raging for 4 years. We actually didn't get involved with that. We were shipping supplies over and supporting countries over there, but we didn't get involved till 1917. And in 1917, in the ramp up for us getting involved, we went from 400,000 troops to 4 million troops. And those troops were all stuck in various camps across the United States in very compact, multiple bunk, crowded areas. So crowding was very common. It's also very common in cities where people lived, multiple families together in small spaces. And so it was kind of the ideal milieu. You had people moving all the way throughout the world. You had a bunch of people that were going into the military, being shipped in and out of theater. And you also had people that had immune systems because of stress, starvation, other things that were under attack. So the medical care, as you can imagine, wasn't so great back in 1918. We actually didn't even know what caused influenza. It wasn't until the 1930s we actually figured that out. There was no antibiotics. Sulfa didn't come on until 35, and penicillin in the middle of World War II. No influenza vaccine, and I'm going to talk more about that. That didn't come out till 1938. So that's almost 20 years. So, everybody keeps talking about the vaccine being ready before the end of the year. Here's 20 years to get it ready to go to have a reliable one. ICUs didn't come into the 50s. We weren't able to support hearts and lungs and livers until that time when there were ICUs. And then the first antiviral therapy wasn't until 1968, which is amantadine and Tamiflu, what we use now. So this is kind of what it looked like when all these people were crowded together. This is Camp Funston in Manhattan, Kansas. And this is actually thought to be ground zero in the United States for influenza. And it was called the Spanish flu, but it should have been called the US flu or United States flu. And I'll show you why in a minute here. H1N1 actually had a high mortality in this very young group. And this was also the group that was involved with the military effort, obviously, mostly males. They lost a lot of people of working age in the economy. And there was also death by this immunologic reaction, what we see with COVID now, this incredible inflammatory response that occurs to the virus. And so India actually was the hardest hit, about 17 million. The United States probably lost 500 to 675,000. So that's a huge number, but it's nowhere near some of the other countries like India. Here's a mail carrier in New York. You know, the mail service has had its issues, but here's this gentleman, you know, through rain, sleet and snow, delivering. That was October 16th, 1918. So if you look at it, this is 1918 here. There was a wave in early part of 1918, and then the very late part of 1918, early 1919, there was a wave, and then there was a third wave in the spring of 1919. So there was 3 real waves. They talk about coughs and sneezes spread diseases. That's hard to say 10 times fast. But there is an analogy where they were trying to support the war effort in 1918, and they were trying to raise war bonds. So Philadelphia decided that they would actually have a parade in the middle of this pandemic to support the war effort, which is a great idea, but not such a great idea in the middle of the pandemic. And so over 500 people actually died from going to this parade. So it's actually considered to be the most lethal parade that we've ever had. But if you look at this, Philadelphia is where they had that Liberty Day parade. This is actually their population dying here. They had the most people in the entire United States dying at the time they decided to do this, this parade. Anyway, and Los Angeles is in here right there. We didn't have such a big rate, but we had a bigger wave sort of later in the year after this one. And then some of these had very small amounts of influenza compared to the others. So this is kind of early record keeping. I showed you the more sophisticated Johns Hopkins collaboration now. So the Spanish flu part of it, Spain was actually neutral in World War I, and so its press wasn't censored. So in the United States, if you wanted to write an article about flu and the troops were all sick and we weren't really ready for the war, you got censored. So they actually couldn't put it in the newspapers at that time. There wasn't a lot of radio and there was no TV. So if you didn't get it out of a newspaper, you didn't get it. So the censors in all these different places, Britain, France, us, Australia, there was very little mention of flu. And that's why it's thought that it was given the name Spanish flu because Spanish flu, the Spain actually identified its king actually had it in the spring of 1918. So that's why it's named the flu as Spanish. So they started banning everything in the United States. You know, you couldn't go to a gym class, your funerals couldn't occur, libraries, schools closed. Does it sound familiar? So you know, we'd actually spent a lot of time in the about 40 to 50 years before this pandemic getting rid of a lot of bacteria. So cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid, bubonic plague. We'd actually identified a lot of these and come up with ways to isolate them, quarantine them, etc. We didn't have great treatments for them just yet. That would take a little bit more time. But public health knew exactly how to deal with pandemics, and it's the same, you know, recipe that we hear today. You know, the mass, isolating, quarantining, case tracing, etc. So there was kind of a warm up to this, which was 1889, the Russian influenza. But even back then, the newspapers weren't very good in reporting. The disease is undoubtedly due to some microorganism which floats in the air. That's okay, which infects the human system, but is generally killed in so doing so. Influenza is only slightly, if at all, contagious. And you know, here we're going to have a huge number of millions of people die from this. And the New York Times, which is felt to be a fairly reliable news source, talking about it's not even contagious. So we have that problem today with lots of news organizations reporting different things about our pandemic. But the way that we isolate and take care of tuberculosis is actually very similar in terms of the thinking of quarantining people. And public health actually was just starting to actually occur in the early 1900s. They were working on, you know, clean water, clean air, clean food, water supplies, immunizations. They were starting to work on those kind of things. And most of it was just people in various cities that had some background in health, and they were used to inform the group. There wasn't really any academic infrastructure. And it's very similar to the way the medical schools were around the year 1900. And at that time, what you did was you took 2 years 1 year was lectures, and it turns out it was only 6 months versus the curriculum, and you did it twice. So that was your first year. The second year, you followed a physician around, and at the end of that year, they just basically deemed you a physician. So 2 years and not really much great training. They weren't associated with universities. They didn't have labs for anatomy or microbiology or any of those kind of things. And there was no hospital component to this. They didn't work in hospitals, they worked in clinics. So the training wasn't very good. So Abraham Flexner was employed by the Carnegie Foundation to actually do a report on all the medical schools in the United States. He traveled to every medical school in the United States, including California. And this is Abraham here. And that's his report, which is pretty interesting. But basically, he said that the way they're training people in Europe is the way to do it. You know, you go to a university, the university has departments that are in microbiology and in all sorts of, you know, physics and medicine and all those kind of things. And that's what you need to have a real medical school, and you need to associate it with a hospital. So a whole bunch of medical schools actually closed right after his report because they were just insufficient. And then the state boards, like California, like I'm licensed in California, I'm not licensed in Nevada. If I want license in Nevada, I have to go there. So each state actually licenses physicians. It's not a national licensing. But California actually had a huge number of people that were basically charlatans, and they were providing nostrums. A nostrum is sort of something that, you know, is peddled, but it's not actually anything that does anything good for you. And so they decided they were going to get rid of all that. Well, right after Flexner got done with that, he decided to look at the public health system. And he actually went through and looked at all the different public health structures in the United States and basically said it was pretty inadequate too. What it resulted in, Johns Hopkins was actually the first university to have a public health component to it. And that's part of the reason that Johns Hopkins is so featured in this particular pandemic. They've had a long history of dealing with public health. And eventually there was actually 10 schools. One of them, Cal Berkeley, was one of the top public health schools in the 30s. It still is, but there's a lot more public health schools now, 32 altogether. Anyway, so that's kind of personal health, public health, and now we're going to talk about mental health. So if you haven't watched a TV show called The Alienists, you actually should, but that's what they used to call psychiatrists, alienists. And a good book to read is The Trial of Charles Guiteau. I'm going to show you that in a minute. But this is kind of what the thinking was pre-1900. It was Sigmund Freud and interpreting dreams, psychoanalysis, that kind of stuff. Garfield was actually shot by Guiteau. Took him a long time to die. It took him about 3 months to die, and all the doctors probably contributed to that by not washing their hands and exploring the wound. He finally died of sepsis. But anyway, this Charles Spitka actually testified at his trial that this was really the first, innocent by reasons of insanity, that this guy was insane. So the group listened to Dr. Spitka and decided that they didn't care, and they hung him anyway. So anyway, it was the first try in the United States to use this insanity plea. It didn't work, but it's really quite an interesting book. It's called The Trial of the Assassin Guiteau. And he was a nut for sure. So if you look back at psychiatry, I love this name. So the American Journal of Insanity, that I think we could probably bring that name back these days, all the things that's going on in our United States. But they actually finally did change their name in 1921 to the American Journal of Psychiatry. But anyway, back then, they really had sort of three areas. They had mania, which is what we call bipolar or manic bipolar. There's schizophrenia, where they sort of hear voices and those kind of things. And then there was depression. None of that treatment was actually available. Lithium was used a little bit in the 1870s, but it wasn't actually FDA approved until the 1970s. Most of these psychotropics came out in the 50s and 70s, and most of the antidepressant medication started in the 50s, and Prozac was kind of a big one in the 80s. So the mental health treatment timeline is really towards the end of the 20th century. So I'm not going to talk about this too much, but what I want to talk about is they had these descriptions of people that had survived the Spanish flu that had problems. They had sleep disturbances, they had depression, they had distraction, they were dizzy, etc. And asylum hospitalizations in Norway, which they had tracked since the 1870s all the way through the 1929, found that there was actually a 7-time increase in the number of people that were hospitalized with some type of mental illness in Norway. So you can see that there was actually a large brain impact even back then of influenza. This is actually a really interesting book. It actually talks about how these people after influenza basically were in a coma. They wouldn't wake up, and they were said to be asleep. It's called Encephalitis lethargica. And von Economo was this Austrian physician who described it. It turns out that it actually has a lot of cross-reactivity with what we call narcolepsy these days. So somebody will be talking to you, then all of a sudden they just fall asleep. So that's hopefully not going to happen during this lecture. But in terms of, it's a real disease, and hypocretin is actually one of the things that actually keeps us awake. So, and it was probably an immunologic response to this hypocretin, and that level went down, and these people took sometimes years or several years to actually wake up. So the only other thing is that there was a movie by Oliver Sacks. It was called Awakening, and it was really describing his use of dopamine in the 1960s to wake some of these people up. The movie is a little bit glamour enhanced, but still interesting. Anyway, I don't think I'm going to skip that. So the last thing is, in terms of mental health, we've talked a lot about the effects of Corona on mental health in the United States. So I sort of wanted to know what happened, right after World War I was there, and the influenza. And actually the rate of suicide was pretty low in the early 1920s. It went up in the 1930s around the time we had the Great Depression, and then back down during World War II. What's even more interesting actually is not just suicide rate, but homicide rates. Homicide rates went continuously up after the first 1918 pandemic. And it actually is still high here in the 80s and 90s. So I think it'll be interesting to see not only suicide rate, but homicide rates and what happens to those after Corona. I think I'm going to skip this because these are psychiatric diagnoses at World War I. But one thing I do want to mention is they actually had a tremendous amount of opium addiction back then. It wasn't a drug that was regulated by anything called the FDA. That would take some time to occur. So states tried to actually get rid of it, and they had all sorts of interventions. But opium addiction has been a problem through hundreds of years in the United States. So this is Jonas Salk. You probably know him a little bit more about polio, and maybe someday I'll give you a talk about polio. It's interesting, actually. But Salk was incredibly smart, but very ambitious person. His first vaccine was actually for influenza. He's the one that developed the influenza vaccine in about 1938. And if you guys have been down to San Diego, that's the Salk Institute being built down there. That was also a picture in 1968. And this is poor little kid getting the Salk vaccine, but eventually he took that technology to polio, and an incredibly bright guy. So 1933, we figured out there was influenza A was the problem. There was the first vaccine, which was Salk. Then that was a monovalent. So we have influenza A and B. We have two different types of A's and B's that we usually immunize now. Now we have a quadrivalent, which hopefully all you folks have gotten your flu shot, but there's two types of influenza A's and two types of influenza B's that it immunizes you against. So I highly recommend that, especially in the middle of COVID, but even without COVID, I recommend it. So I know there's people that don't like to take it. It makes you feel sick, whatever. You can get a small reaction to it, but it's still the best way to prevent yourself from having a serious reaction to the influenza when you have, chronic heart or lung disease. So, is history helpful? And just sort of what does it say about our future for post-corona? Well, the first thing is that we're actually losing a lot of healthcare workers. There's been 1,150 healthcare workers that have died of COVID, actually, as of September 13th. 12 of those have been in the United States. Actually, the majority of those people have been nurses. Nurses actually have it much worse than physicians in terms of number of times they go into COVID rooms. First responders have been a problem. Physicians as well, 25 physicians. And then the distribution of the races obviously is pretty much representative of healthcare. I just wanted to tip my hat to Dr. Weilan Li. He's the Chinese physician that actually put out the word that this was an epidemic at that point because it was localized to China, but that it was lethal. He was actually censured by the Chinese government and told to retract what he had said. Eventually, he actually caught it himself and died from it. So he died February 7th, 2020. So, you know, a very brave individual trying to spread the word that this was coming. And I think it would have helped the world if we would have acknowledged this, you know, much earlier. But clearly it was going to come no matter what. And probably the genie had gotten out of the bottle even before he actually admitted it, because the virus strain that we see in New York is actually from Europe. It's not from China. The one we see on the West Coast is the version that comes from China. So that's the connection of different types of airline passageways and where the virus actually occurs. Okay, so you know, I think there's some hope that our healthcare system will actually be better because of this. One of those things is obviously telemedicine and ambulatory services are being moved around, as is inpatient. So, you know, could we come up with a better way to manage either heart disease or diabetes or hypertension or obesity such that our population is more able to stand the next pandemic, because the people that have done the worst with our current pandemic are people that actually have chronic diseases. So trying to improve the general health may help us there. You know, can we move away from sort of pills and procedure towards, you know, truly, you know, delivering health to a population? Our healthcare spending has been dramatically affected by it. Many hospitals, you know, have had to scale down their amount of elective surgery, and that's one of the revenue streams that keeps the hospital alive. So hospitals, I think, are going to have a real tough time in the next few years staying open, not only because of their own revenue, but state, federal, county revenue is actually going to go down because of the changes in funding. So public health likes to say that 80% of your health determinants are behaviors, lifestyle, social, and economic conditions. So not genes, but your environment. And so we don't seem to be doing a really good job with trying to improve that. I think that the technology that we've developed for telemedicine may actually allow us to do better care and more timely care for our population. So we'll see if that works out. And not seeing people in clinic worries me a little bit, because I like to see people and talk to them and see how they're doing, but we'll see how that goes. Certainly the healthcare system is going to have to deal with burnout and PTSD too. You know, the doctors and nurses and pharmacists and respiratory therapists, and even, you know, the administrators and other people in hospitals, they're working, you know, triple time right now to try to deal with this. And I think it's going to be very difficult for them to not have some degree of PTSD or burnout. It's going to be tough for physicians, I think, to find jobs, because a lot of companies are not hiring people because of this financial constriction I was telling you about. And then there may be this kind of permanent inefficiency. Like, so in rehabilitation services, we can't put in the normal number of people because we have to scale that down. Same thing for gyms and other places. And then, you know, for administrators to predict the healthcare needs of the future is going to be very complicated. I know I'm pretty close to being done. Should I, Kurt, are you okay, or should I scale down? And you're on mute.
Bill, are you almost done?
Well, I'm not almost, but I can actually go towards the very end and just finish, if that's okay.
Well, whatever you think is best. I mean, I think the group has time on their hands, so we don't want to miss anything.
Well, let me just hit 2 slides. So we're talking about economic recovery. So this is time 0 of whenever the pandemic occurred. This is the Great Depression, and it was 4 to 5 years before the gross domestic product, GDP, recovered. This is something like the recession of 2007, 2008. There really wasn't a very long recovery to that. And Spanish flu essentially had no no positive recovery till about 3 years afterwards. This is the White House Council on Economic Advisors, so this may or may not be the right thing, but what they're saying is GDP is down for about a year and then starts back up towards the normal value. So whether that occurs or not, we'll see. These are the different areas of our economy that have been adversely affected. Leisure and hospitality, education and health services are two that have taken the huge hit here, but in every area of the economy actually has. So last but not least, I want to finish with a couple of things. One is these are called nostrums. I was telling you about these. So these are things that you sell but don't really work. A lot of these old time things, this is around the time of 1818, 1819, were something you take that would affect your bowels. So something about, cleansing the bowels, that kind of stuff. This is actually talking about the influenza vaccine in trial stage. Obviously, it was 20 more years before we actually had a vaccine, and nobody actually knew that influenza was the etiology. So God only knows what was in those vaccines. This is some writing that was done. Obviously, they didn't have electronic media, but we are quarantined, I guess, for about 1 million years. But if we don't get out of here, we'll burst right into tears. So I think they had the same feeling we did about all this quarantine stuff. So the other part I wanted to show you was sort of social media. We have that of the electronic version, and I don't know if anybody is a Hunger Games person, but this is leaving to get your family groceries and toilet paper here. This is laughing when people fighting over toilet paper, and this is realizing you're out of toilet paper. This is Corona Lisa. And this is normal people that can't travel or socialize, are depressed, but gamers are actually having a good time. And this is be like Darth Vader, wear a mask, doesn't visit his son or daughter, socially and emotionally distant, follows orders. So that's kind of the ideal candidate for, so I like this one. Chuck Norris has been exposed to the coronavirus and the virus is now in quarantine for the next 2 weeks. So, so this was trying to explain coronavirus to the people in Florida. So they took a hurricane map and they stuck a corona bottle on it. So I really like that. This makes it easier for Floridians to understand coronavirus because they obviously, they had their spring break down there and they opened schools and everything else. So the last one, I really like this. This is actually a sculpture that's in Berlin, but this is all the people arguing in one of the government sectors, and the water is actually advancing. They're about to go underwater and they're still arguing about it, climate change. So anyway, this is one other book I think is really well done. It talks about the effect of germs on the fate of human societies and talks about the Americas and the essentially the wiping out of indigenous people in the United States and Canada and Central and South America because of germs more than guns and steel. So anyway, that's pretty much what I went through. I will stop there, and hopefully that was entertaining. It's kind of a whirlwind tour of 2 different pandemics and trying to compare that to what we've got today. There's a lot of similarities, and they obviously got through all this, but had a lot of pain and agony and suffering just like we've got today. And hopefully we'll all get through this in the near future, but I think it's going to be probably middle of next year before we get back to anything that looks remotely like what we had before March of this year. So anyway, happy to take any questions, and thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Stringer, thanks. That was just outstanding. Quick question. Are you recording this? Have you been recording this?
I think so. I'm going to go off the share and see if I can. I'm going to pause it, and I may have to put this on a jump drive or something to give it to you.
That's fine, and I can come over and pick it up and
okay.
get it to Jocelyn.
I'll make sure I get it off the thing. I think it's going to be an MP3 or something like that.
Okay, that's fine. I hope we've preserved that wonderful presentation.
Well,
Let's all give Dr. Stringer a round of applause, huh?
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank
you, Dr. Stringer.
Thank you all for putting up with that. Yeah, it's good to see you all. Good to see your faces. So, well,
and you've got a couple minutes for some questions, Dr. Stringer?
Yeah, I'm okay. I have to get to clinic by 1, but I got a few minutes.
Okay, well, we've got about 8 minutes, you guys, for cues. So raise your hand if you have a question, and Jocelyn or myself will recognize you. That's
fine, and I can also send you the slides if anybody wants to look up those books or whatever. And it looks like Jocelyn actually put them in the chat room as well. Thank you.
You can email it to peppioneers@gmail.com. I'll make sure it gets out to everybody.
It's very kind of you. Thank you.
Questions?
Very quiet group.
It might be a first that there's no questions.
Well, I'll ask one.
Usually everybody would get up to get some dessert at this point, but that's not happening. So,
Dr. Stringer, can you just say one more time, what's your gut feeling on when this pandemic is mostly going to be behind us? And what's your opinion on the status of vaccines?
well, the mostly behind us is probably a lot further in the future than we hope. I think that we'll have a vaccine trial by the end of the year that shows that it works. Then we have to produce it and administer it to people. And then it has to have the effect of changing the amount of corona cases we've gotten, especially the ones that get hospitalized. So I can't imagine all that's going to happen until probably the mid part of next year. And then at that point, there seems to be a large group that will probably not take the vaccine, even if it's available. That's a problem. And the second thing is that there's multiple vaccines trials, and some of them actually have been stopped already for side effects. So let's just say you're going to immunize everybody in the United States, say 350 million people. So let's say there's a 0.0001 chance of something bad, Guillain-Barré, for instance. Because remember, Guillain-Barré came in 1976 with swine flu, and swine flu never came. So the vaccine was a bigger problem than the flu. But in this particular case, if you have a very, very small incidence of stuff and you multiply that by 350 million, you have a huge number of people with a bad disease. So we have to make sure it's safe. The way to make sure it's safe is to administer it to a large population and see what happens, because clinical trials, even if they're 20 or 30,000, that's still not a million, that's still not 350 million. And you may find very rare side effects that you didn't find in that first thing. So I think it's the vaccine should be available probably early next year. And then it will take some time to scale that up and administer it. They'll probably give it to healthcare people and other vulnerable populations first, and then the rest of us. So that means that probably mid next year, if enough people take the vaccine, that we maybe get down to something that's more normal. But the predicted economic effects of this may take probably until 2023 to actually resolve. That's the economic part separate from the medical part. So I think we're talking about a long haul here, unfortunately. I wish I could say it's a lot better. I certainly wouldn't take any vaccine before the election, I'll tell you that. Because, I don't know if you saw the letter that the prior head of the CDC sent to the current head of the CDC, just basically saying all this political interaction is nonsense, and, stick to the science. So we'll see if that happens or not. I hope that, from the CDC down to our state governments and our local governments, we start to get more agreement about wearing masks and staying away from each other and things like that. That's what's worked for thousands of years. We know that works. And then we need to get a vaccine that's safe. And, you've all done some task in a very short period of time. It's very easy to make errors. So you don't want errors in a vaccine trial. So the more time you have to see if that is okay, it works, it doesn't have side effects, it's effective, that's the time probably to dive into getting a vaccine.
Thank you. Any more questions before we let Dr. Stringer go to clinic?
Well, thank you. I'm happy you've got my email. You're happy to any questions I can answer, and I'm happy to do some other talks if you need some hopefully entertainment, or at least some nutrition for the mind. How's that? We don't have our sizzler anymore.
No, but we've got Dr. Stringer, and you're such a wonderful, wonderful presenter, and so informative and so interesting, and we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Well, very kind of you, and you all stay safe.
One more round of applause.
We'll be back soon. So.
Thank you so much.
Bye, you guys. Now,
bye-bye.
Now, Kurt, I'm going to send the host back to you, so you can turn off this meeting whenever you want to. Okay.
Okay.
Or Jocelyn, do you want me to send it to you or Kurt?
No, send it to Kurt.
Okay.